Thank you, everyone. Thanks all for joining me this evening. I'm honoured at the invitation to speak tonight as part of this research community. And having only recently graduated, I've never been more relieved, satisfied and relaxed to be on campus. Except if you count that time I got a car park after 9 a.m. That was in 2014, so it doesn't count. Thank you to the College of Arts and Social Sciences for recognising gains in research which better consider Indigenous perspectives and for providing a platform to discuss the challenges, future ideas and innovations these perspectives have to offer. Thank you to my family who are here to support me, my friends and colleagues who have come along, and to all of you who I'm yet to meet. To Auntie Matilda House, your warm welcome is a gracious blessing. I acknowledge the strength of your country and its characterful spring expression. The journey of the bogong moth connects my Uluru country with yours, and I acknowledge your ongoing custodianship, an ancient seat of governance and one of the most wonderful places to live and raise a family. Gabaninda Walgan, thank you, Aunt. Back in 2015, my sisters and I and our singing group Bilia performed a couple of songs in our Uluru language on this very stage in support for the lecture which drew on the role of Indigenous language in research. That year, research with the Ngarrindjara people of the Western Desert was being recognised. And those of you who were there would remember some of the work being presented, including work of Lizzie Ellis with her Story Wire, introducing country itself as a storyteller, punctuating particles of red desert sand with her long piece of slightly curved wire. Performative storytelling and its capacity to convey complex meanings being etched into recognition as an interesting and Indigenous-led research methodology. That night, my sisters and I sang our Uluru country into an association with Lizzie's Ngarrindjara lands. And it wasn't stated that evening, but this connection is an old songline which continues from the Western Desert into the red dusted grounds of northern New South Wales, of Angledool and Narran Lakes, where my family's from. We must have done justice to that cultural connection that night. The ANU News even described it as authentic. Thank you, ANU News. So I'm back now on the stage, hoping for a similar compliment in a future news item, this time driven by the songline of the Bogong Moth, hoping to be as epic and courageous as their southern journeys are. My talk tonight springs from concerns I have with contemporary museum discourse. As a researcher, museum practitioner and teacher, as my abstract suggests, these concerns lie with the enduring dichotomous relationship assumed between Indigenous people and museums. This involves a persisting separation of parties, setting them up as contrasting, oppositional, discrete and distinct. It's an enduring dichotomy which has informed the development of key theoretical concepts and has also influenced museum practice. Arguably, the oppositional quality of this relationship is being reignited and leveraged in some efforts to decolonise the museum, a call which, although popular, can often favour simplistic shortcuts over reflective and collaborative advancement. More on this later. In 2019, we must recognise the many ways and different ways that Indigenous people are engaging with and in museums as visitors, researchers, teachers, artists and makers, as staff members, community delegations, consultants and suppliers of goods and services. From councils and advisory boards to visiting students, Indigenous faces are present in some way within Australian museums every day. Perpetuating dichotomous relationships is, put simply, not reflective of contemporary museum environments. A much messier, intercultural and cross-cultural middle ground has emerged, and for the benefit of all. Why is this not really present in the theory landscape? perhaps a result of the drifting alliances between museums and universities. For some reason, the gulf between practice and theory is almost far enough to produce an echo. Critical praxis is unfortunately today as stagnant and tragic as our darling river, devoid of flow, neither generative nor life-giving. This is a concern for our sector and our cultural communities. It's entirely understandable that these binary oppositions exist within the museum space. Museums are built on foundations of this difference. And through the collection and display of our cultural material, difference is enshrined as valuable, and as well it is locked in stasis. The material archive is not set up to be challenged, even if we're open to the notion that anthropologists of the past were as flawed with their own methods and research approaches as many of us are today. American anthropologist Joseph Birdsall was a tender 28 years old when he came through my Uluru country, measuring crania and the length of people's tongues. Yet his research record with Norman Tyndale, who was 36 years old at the time, retains an impenetrable integrity. The historical record is protected and the difference between Indigenous subjects and the interpreters of knowledges are maintained. Now, I'm not asking that this history is rewritten. I'm not asking for that. This archive is an important factor in our communities being able to better understand our difficult histories. I'm here today to recognise the way that museum spaces have changed and to seek support from you to play some part with me in sketching out some of the changed spaces, to complicate the simplistic notions which proliferate our theory space, and to inject some new and much needed energy. Museums in Australia can step purposefully towards more inclusive cultural futures, rise to meet the calls for truth-telling, invite new research methods and perspectives onto existing and extensive collections, enrich a sense of place in collection databases, and change what it means to collect, exhibit, and ascribe value in a materially shifting world, in a world of waste, and in a world of change. What should we be custodians of in the Anthropocene? It's probably time we brought all sides in and defined this together. I identify as a Uluru person from freshwater country of central western New South Wales. Our river floodplains interweave continuously back and forth with red soil country as we step in and out of the edge of the rangelands. These homelands are called our Nurumbar, and I have tracked a connection from Uluru country to here, to Ngunnawal country, via our waterways, down the Darling to the Murray, Murrumbidgee, to where now I live with my family. My mother's side's non-Indigenous Australian, and we recognise our Irish roots in County Clare, although the hilly coastline of Coogee in East Sydney are where our family's tracks, including some of my own, are sung and remembered. I'm both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. As my biography states, I work at the National Museum of Australia as part of the team developing the new Environmental History Gallery to open in 2021. This will be one of 3 permanent gallery spaces and will focus on country as being expressive and one which has been in active dialogue with all life in its many regional and varied ways. I've worked in other museums in interpretation and programming, and I've also worked broadly with audiences, including what the sector would term non-traditional museum audiences. Non-traditional museum audiences. I believe museums should exist to interrogate, reveal their own existing and vast collections, the journey of objects, relationships they represent, the archive of material which is a product of the interface of our shared histories, however traumatic, surprising, delightful, upsetting and concerning these histories may be. I believe museums are important social spaces, important cultural spaces. The big and broad conversations needed in our society right now, those which require truth-telling and recognition, need spaces to be thought through and made visible and accessible for the broader community. Museums can and should play an active role in providing these spaces, and I have an expectation that they do and they will. I'm also actively researching museum practice and museum collections, most recently involved in a project investigating some of the distributed collections of Indigenous Australian material across the UK, a collaborative project between the ANU, the NMA and the British Museum. My PhD research similarly zeroed in on Uluru objects in museum collections, just like these. I looked at their collection journeys, their deployment in exhibition and on display, and their custodianship, both in an historical and in a contemporary space. I am a museum anthropologist. Traditionally, you might classify me as an outsider in the museum space, and perhaps I see myself as an outsider in the museum space. I have used museums as field sites. I critically engage with the ways they enact custodianship. I also consider the historical legacies, as well as investigate contemporary Indigenous modes of engagement. I am both a member of what the theory often refers to as a source community, as well as a museum professional. Just as my Uluru country alternates from black soil to red dust, I'm both an insider and an outsider, or an outsider and an insider, depending on who's asking. I need you to remember all of this. It's essential that you know my standpoint and the trajectory I'm moving in throughout this talk. I can't expect you to join me at my standpoint, but I can ask you if you're willing to recognise your own and to meet me somewhere in the middle, and it will be new ground for us both. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a bit now and look towards the key concepts in museum theory that relate to the way that Indigenous people and museums engage. I take a particular focus here on how museums work as contested spaces and how the players within are conceived. The key theoretical concept active in museum theory of particular interest tonight is the theory of the contact zone, developed originally by linguist Mary Louise Pratt in 1991. Pratt describes a contact zone as social spaces where cultures meet, clash and grapple with each other, often in contexts of highly asymmetrical relations of power, such as colonialism, slavery or their aftermaths, as they are lived out in many parts of the world today. And we can already appreciate how this lends itself so neatly to museums. I almost couldn't believe how perfectly it fit when I came across this. There was just this sense of relief, or surprise and relief, when I first read this. And also there was a sense of empowerment too. I just had no idea that spaces could be recognised in this way. Pratt's contact zone was adapted into a museum context by James Clifford in 1997, a period when new museology was distinguishing itself away from traditional museum foundations of centralised authority. And you can see this shift represented in Clifford's language, where there's an acknowledgement of tension and contest. He says, when museums are seen as contact zones, their organising structure as a collection becomes an ongoing historical, political, moral relationship, a power-charged set of exchanges, of push and pull. These quotes are familiar to some of you, I'm sure. The contact zone theory has helped to better recognise the residues of colonialism present within museums, particularly museums with ethnographic or anthropological collections. The theory, or the way the theory has been used, has largely been to suggest that these colonial legacies are not only present, but remain in some way active. Again, this concept relies on a dichotomous relationship existing between museums and Indigenous parties. I've heard this theory described as being outdated. 1997 is 22 years ago, and it's easy to perhaps take this point. It does, however, remain highly influential, or the context zone theory remains highly influential with how we conceptualise Indigenous people's engagement with museums, mostly because it recognises that engagement with museums today are deeply entangled with the past. The theory has provided a discursive context to concepts like the source community, which recognises the originating cultural realms from which collected objects are produced. Also that these originating cultural communities continue today. On one hand, incredibly important for Indigenous associations and originating contexts to be recognised. But on the other hand, wouldn't it be great if communities weren't defined only in relation to collected objects as their source? The language is so explicitly self-serving, it's almost audacious. The reciprocal of this is museums as destination communities. The contact zone theory calls out museums as difficult sites and provides a framework to consider why. It has, however, created a bit of a rod for our back. We've consistently interpreted the opposing sides within the contact zone as black and white, Indigenous and museum. In this case, I would agree with the notion that the contact zone is outdated, as the battle lines cannot be simply drawn. Clifford's treatment of the concept for museums has been widely taken up in academia. However, there has not been an equal investigation of what the context zone theory can offer Indigenous communities. This is one of its downfalls, and perhaps where critical praxis could have helped scope the application of the concept in real terms for both Indigenous agents as well as museums. Pratt, it seems, offered more guts to the concept, further probing it, its opportunities, its characteristics, particularly for the subjugated parties. She identifies the struggle for interpretive power as inherently characteristic of the contact zone. She also wades interestingly into the arts of the contact zone, capturing sites where the subjugated party might hold agency. These sites include concepts like transculturation and autoethnography, which I found interesting and useful in my PhD research. I subsequently took on board autoethnography as a method in my thesis. Pratt describes it thus: the term in either form refers to instances in which colonised subjects undertake to represent themselves in ways that engage with the coloniser's terms. If ethnographic texts are means by which Europeans represent to themselves their usually subjugated others, autoethnographic texts are texts the others construct in response to or in dialogue with these metropolitan representations. Here are some great examples of autoethnographic expressions made in response to museum collections, in this case specifically in relation again to anthropologist Norman Tyndale. This is a work by artist Ioannis Scarce, where she's drawn from Tyndale's collection of photographic work and her own artistic practice of blown glass. And the numbers on these, these blown glass figures represent yams, and the numbers printed on them correlate to the serial numbers assigned to members of her family by Norman Tyndale. And Vernon Arkey's work as well, where his amazing sketches are again in response to the photographic archive of Norman Tyndale. The same method of autoethnography, also deployed by Indigenous researcher Brenda L. Croft, presenter of last year's lecture, seems to similarly offer Indigenous scholars a side of agency within the contact zone of academic research. When it comes to museums as sites of engagement for Indigenous agents, contact zone theory is perhaps simplistically applied. Museums as contact zones implies a standing power dynamic, a home ground advantage for the museum, and implies a David and Goliath scale battle. The scale of contest between Indigenous people and the institutions which enshrine all of our collective histories is never fair. In presupposition alone, you've all assumed who will be doing the fighting and who will be doing the defending. Pitting people against a political and historical behemoth is suggestive of foregone conclusions. Small gains at best, a bigger fight for a different time. But it's not just unfair on the black side. This unfair contest is also working to undermine the capacity for non-Indigenous museum workers to be agents of change themselves. Museums are, after all, driven and activated by people. Instead, maybe if we're able to identify a whole system of contact zones in operation, then we might begin to better grasp the nuance of contemporary museum work. Community consultation activities, for example, play out in a very different contact zone, where power dynamics are often flipped, often where the museum is in pursuit of support or collaboration with Indigenous communities. Those of you in the room who have been in some way a part of these engagements know how difficult and delicate and loaded these moments can be. These conversations often don't happen within museum spaces either, but they happen in land council offices, with elders and community groups out on country. They happen in schools, at research field sites, reburial grounds, community-run keeping places, and they are heavy with legacy and protocols, and they're often also stressful and tense, and perhaps they should be. I've been on both sides of the consultation table, and these dynamics are worthy of further consideration in the theory domain. How else are we supposed to get better at them? Exhibitions and galleries are again contact zones where audiences are implicated within a legacy of relationships involving authority, power and interpretation. While the contact isn't between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, the situation is still a product of our colonial past, the collection and display and interpretation of our shared histories. Regarding the funding environment, perhaps an internal contact zone and site of push and pull within museums, the struggle for interpretation in a tense environment, funding instability. What does it say to accept financial sponsorship from the mining, fossil fuel industry, big tech or the government? Increasingly, in an era of public scrutiny, this is as active a contact zone as there could ever be. Considering these other sites also as contact zones does not diminish Indigenous people's ongoing struggles with museums. It instead provides a mechanism to consider the messy aftermath of colonisation or a settler colonial society, as well as our inherited legacy. Every single person in this room should be able to consider themselves active within these contact zones and thus recognise the necessity for it to move beyond a simple two-sided opposition to one that can accommodate multiple standpoints, including our own. Black, white, repatriate, collect, community, museum, source, destination. Museum theory relies heavily on binary oppositions. Innovation lies in how we can investigate a different way and how we can prepare a shared space and interface where difference can meet and where multiple voices are influential. This site must inform future directions in the custodianship of material culture and have the capacity to shift oppositional standpoints on both sides and on all sides. It all begins with one essential question, and it's one which we never ask. Is there a role for museums today? Should museums exist? A question like this, though, can't just be asked with no context. It needs scaffolding. And this is where Martin Nakata's cultural interface theory can assist. As the name suggests, the cultural interface is a middle ground. It's a site where you and I can expect to meet. We can't just turn up in the interface, and we're not automatically existing in this shared space. The cultural interface relies on the revelation of one standpoint and then the movement on a trajectory into a middle ground to be met by others there. Within this space, we both have ideas of one another. We define each other, we navigate each other, we challenge each other, and we engage. This theory is useful because, if anything, it requires firstly a recognition of a standpoint and then a movement from that standpoint towards a deliberate meeting with others who have come from their own respective directions. Nakada's own description of the cultural interface refers to a matrix of abstracted discourses that constructs a consciousness of ourselves which is outside of the local and outside of how life is experienced. I've worked with Martin before, and I remember him explaining this to me once in much the same way. But I unfortunately got distracted when he used the word matrix, and my thoughts turned to Keanu Reeves dodging bullets in slow motion from the 1999 film of the same name. Easily distracted. But little did I know at the time that this is exactly what Martin was talking about. I was listening. No. This matrix business is when the structure from within which you are operating becomes visible, or you choose for it to become visible. You do this in the film by taking the red pill. In the cultural interface, you do this by articulating your own standpoint. You detangle the discursive formations which position you, and you prepare to engage with others who have done the same. It's like you can see the system from the outside. And I would have to admit that I think this might be much easier for an Indigenous person to do, as we're always being made aware of our outsider position to the system. Nakada's background in Indigenous education, himself a Torres Strait Islander, has him deploy a powerful example to demonstrate the merits of the concept of the cultural interface by drawing an attention to what he calls the locale of the learner. With this, he asks us to consider the experience of an Indigenous student. At school, learning about Indigenous histories, experiences and identities through textbooks and teachers, and we'd have to assume most of these teachers to be non-Indigenous. How is this student positioned to engage with Indigenous histories when it's entirely possible that his own experiences do not reflect what he's being taught? How does this set his peers up to understand their classmates' identity, his experience and his realities as an Indigenous person? Nakada's cultural interface requires us to recognise this Indigenous student's location in relation to what he or she is being taught. If you were the student's teacher, would this change your approach? And how? Nakada's cultural interface has been incredibly interesting for me to apply to museums, especially to education programs and resources produced by museums. How many of these are written with the perspective of the locale of the learner or that Indigenous student? What happens if we read these resources from this particular position, from the position of this Indigenous student in a class, visiting the museum, on an excursion, with their peers, away from home? It casts a new and important perspective on our own agency in interpreting history to others, and even how we understand Indigenous people as audiences. Indigenous audiences are woefully neglected in museum theory. In an era so focused on audience-led approaches, this seems a true gap in the theory. It's another example of a middle ground. It's the limbo. It's the space that's not clear-cut. Museum theory has travelled great strides to recognise a deeply anchored colonial standpoint. And I say deeply anchored, as it is generally accepted that the legacies of these foundations are still visible today, and they're still active. Museum theory also has a body of work spent on both recognising, Indigenous participation in this space, and also the theory goes into a bit of detail in defining these standpoints as well as the parameters. And I did say earlier that these spaces are one of the places where we define each other. Indigenous agents are similarly actively defining museums and their standpoints too. Articulations of these are less visible in museum theory. However, they're highly visible in visual art fields and are present in our contemporary vernacular. I'll just show a couple of examples here. This is one of Julie Goff's work by Jonathan Jones. A work by Brooke Andrew, installation by Brooke Andrew back in 1998, quite early on. Judy Watson. Brenda Croft. Christian Thompson. And my sister, Lucy Simpson. So this space, in the vernacular, this is where we might consider again the call to decolonise the museum, which has a foothold locally. This call is global, and it's often aimed at powerful cultural institutions which have collections of cultural material from other places. The call to decolonise a museum is predominantly a social movement, with high visibility on social media platforms and typically a large global network of a shared understanding that principally our histories are incredibly problematic and that there's something we can do about it. It focuses chiefly on the legacies of these histories, outing contemporary museum practice as an ongoing form of colonisation. The British Museum attracts a great deal of this outrage, concerned publics drawing in singular collection items as evidence for the call. The Parthenon marbles, Benin bronzes, Rapa Nui statues, Australia's Gwiggle shield. The general feeling is that if people want them back, they should have them returned. So there's a strong repatriation aim with the call to decolonise, as well as aims to diversify employment, be transparent with funding sources, and to critically consider modes of interpretation, including the use of text and language. I have some mixed or complicated feelings about all of this, and I think it might be because I'm not sure the objective to decolonise has been clearly enough thought through by those who seem to want it. What does it mean to decolonise? Can one detangle themselves from their discursive positioning enough to wriggle completely free? What happens then? Sometimes the call to decolonise also takes on an activist nature, which is willfully blind to contemporary museum work or anything that challenges an idealistic notion that museums are still colonial and in an active state of colonisation. Again, they assume a contact zone that has simply drawn binary opponents: colonise, decolonise. Powerful, subjugated, white, black, male, female, old, young, old white men with beards. You'll hear this and you'll see this, throughout this discourse. Calls to decolonise museums don't deal well with nuance nor middle ground, it seems. Interestingly, for museums that have heeded the call to decolonise and responded, their responses have been more in line with what Nakata talks about in the cultural interface theory. They're exploring and engaging with their own standpoints. Their efforts are all relative to their individual situations, of course, making their actions at times seem subtle, while at others they're glaringly obvious. The work by the Northern Norway Art Museum to decolonise has gained a deal of publicity and is framed squarely with an objective of redress. They went about it very visibly, through the display of work, through purposeful, decisive moves with their text, through the merch they sold in their shop, through their programming. But these moves have been happening in degrees for years, though, and it's sometimes unexpected where you'll find it. Perhaps surprisingly, the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford has been engaging with their discursive entanglements for some time now. But admittedly, it's difficult to see beyond the 19th century museum aesthetic to recognise the outputs. Their programming is interesting and reflective and engages visitors in the dialogue. Really encourage you to have a look at the suite of offerings they've got, and particularly what they've got on at the moment for Black History Month. The Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, the Folklife collection at the National Museum of Ireland as well, are actively grappling with their historical loaded foundations acknowledging the aspects of this history that are still active, and they respond through their own brands of museum practice. These efforts have all been in the service of activating a cultural interface to meet with others from differing positions. This is good. This is the way forward. And these are all good reasons for museums to keep existing. I'm not sure that it's decolonising the museum though, or if that's even possible, but I do think it's really positive. So these middle grounds are slowly emerging. But what differentiates a contact zone from a cultural interface? And theoretically they can be the same thing, but I think loosening the expectations that the parties are going to clash or conflict or oppose or disagree is essential. They may do this, but we need to hold the door open for other forms of engagement to play out. Agreement, mutually beneficial outcomes, surprise, satisfaction, delight. Something we're yet to cover tonight is the importance of governance of these shared spaces, and governance is of course fundamental to their success. Indigenous agency in the protocol arena is recognised, particularly when it comes to discussing negotiating custodianship and repatriation of sacred material and human remains. Perhaps an overlooked cultural interface which has seen extraordinary gains after long-fought struggles of unimaginable complexity and gravity. Extremely difficult material, and the hard work of this continues for us all. How protocols support governance of shared spaces is indeed worthy of further investigation in the theory realm, and surely a site of collaborative research and Indigenous-led solutions. Governance of cultural interfaces are sensitive, important, and essentially responsive, highlighting again the need for care, nuance and time in responsive dialogue. There is a hard road for us all ahead, but we should remain encouraged. And to return to the question as to whether museums should exist, I'm encouraged by the words of Dawn Casey, who back in 2001, as Director of the National Museum of Australia, declared that Australia desperately needs places for intelligent dissent and debate. Museums can encourage people to understand the limits of their own experience, to cross the imagination boundary and gain an insight into the viewpoints of other people or other times. And it appears my carefully selected array of Indigenous voices tonight are all saying the same thing. I've taken you one tiny step into my way of understanding this field of theory, how it has frustrated me and also inspired me. I try where possible to apply these theory situations to real life so that I can make sense of them. So I'd love now to return back to the flight of the bogong moth and back again to the country that's resting under our feet. This land is a wonderful example of a cultural interface. I mentioned it earlier as an important and ancient seat of governance. Many, many people have journeyed here to meet and negotiate difference in service to something bigger. This convergence and our interface remains operational today. You and I are part of it. And it's through this that I would like to acknowledge country and its power and to reinstate my thanks for this opportunity to converge. Thank you.